An 8-year-old girl gave her only cherished possession to a homeless man. When his son arrived in a luxury car the next day, her whole world froze. The subway rattled the walls of Faith's bedroom at 6:15 a.m., right on schedule. The 8-year-old girl opened her eyes, staring at the peeling paint on her ceiling. She didn't need an alarm clock. The trains kept better time than any clock in their Bronx apartment. "Faith, baby, you up?" Her mother's voice carried through the thin walls, tired but warm. "Yes, Mama." Faith swung her legs off the bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor. The morning routine started like it always did. Faith stood in front of her small mirror, carefully adjusting her school uniform, a navy blue skirt and white shirt she'd gotten from the church donation box. The clothes were used but clean, pressed carefully by her mother the night before. Her fingers worked through her braids, each one tied with different colored bands: red, blue, yellow, green. The braids were 3 days old now, done by her mother during her rare Sunday off. In the kitchen, her mother was already in her supermarket uniform, the red vest hanging loose over her shoulders. Dark circles showed under her eyes from her late-night cleaning shift. "Eat your breakfast, baby. Can't be late today." Her mother placed a bowl of oatmeal on their small table, the surface scratched from years of use. Faith spooned the oatmeal slowly, watching her mother gulp down coffee. The morning light filtered through their window, catching the dust in the air. Outside, car horns and street voices mixed with the rumble of another passing train. "Mama, is you coming to the science fair today?" Faith asked, though she already knew the answer. Her mother's face tightened. "Baby, you know I gotta work. Mr. Thompson won't let me switch shifts again this month." She reached across the table, her hand rough from cleaning chemicals, and squeezed Faith's smaller one. "Next time, okay?" Faith nodded, pushing down the familiar ache in her chest. She'd seen the past due notice her mother tried to hide under the mail pile. They needed money more than they needed her mother at a school fair. The walk to school took them past Joey's Delicatessen, where Mr. Jenkins sat in his usual spot. The old man's white beard was unkempt, his clothes dirty, but his eyes alert. He never asked for money, just sat there watching people pass. "Keep walking, Faith," her mother said, pulling her closer. "Don't stare." But Faith couldn't help looking. Mr. Jenkins wore the same blue jacket every day, even now when autumn was turning cold. His hands shook slightly as he hugged himself for warmth. At school, Faith sat in her usual spot by the window. Ms. Rodriguez's fifth-grade classroom was full of project displays for the science fair. Faith's project sat on her desk. A simple demonstration of plant growth in different soils, the lima beans sprouting in paper cups. "And here's Jessica's project on electricity," Ms. Rodriguez announced, standing beside an elaborate setup with lights and switches. Jessica's parents had helped her build it. The materials probably bought from a real science store, not scrounged from around the house like Faith's beans. Faith watched as other parents started arriving for the fair. They wore business clothes or medical scrubs, carrying phones and tablets, taking pictures of their children's projects. Empty chairs lined the wall where parents without days off would have sat. During lunch, Faith sat with her friend Tanya, both of them sharing a peanut butter sandwich Faith's mother had made that morning. "Your mama coming later?" Tanya asked, breaking the sandwich in half. "She got work," Faith said, watching Jessica show her project to her father, who wore a suit and tie. "Both jobs today." After school, Faith walked home alone, her key hanging on a string around her neck. The apartment was quiet except for the trains. She went to her room and pulled out her grandmother's blanket from under her pillow. The yarn was soft, each square a different color, like her hair ties. Her grandmother had finished it just before she got sick last winter. Faith wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, breathing in the faint smell of her grandmother's house that still clung to the yarn. She did her homework at the kitchen table, the blanket keeping her warm as the sun set and the apartment grew cold. They kept the heat low to save money. Her mother wouldn't be home until after midnight. Faith made herself a sandwich for dinner, did her homework, and got ready for bed. She could hear Mrs. Chun in the apartment next door watching her evening shows through the wall. In bed, Faith pulled her grandmother's blanket tight around her. Another train passed, shaking the building's bones. Through her window, she could see the lights of other apartments, other families together for dinner. Mr. Jenkins would be somewhere out there too, probably still in his spot by Joey's, maybe shivering in the growing cold. Faith closed her eyes, holding the blanket closer. Tomorrow would be another day of the same routine: trains, school, empty chairs, quiet apartment. But tonight, something shifted in her mind as she thought about Mr. Jenkins and his thin blue jacket, about empty chairs and full ones, about blankets that kept some people warm while others shivered on sidewalks. She fell asleep to the rhythm of the trains, her decision already forming like her lima beans sprouting in their paper cups, small but growing stronger by the hour. The night settled over the Bronx, stars hidden behind the city's glow, as Faith slept under her grandmother's last gift. Not knowing tomorrow would be the day, everything changed. Faith sat at the kitchen table after school, her grandmother's blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The apartment was empty again, quiet except for the rattling windows when trains passed. Her math homework lay spread out in front of her, but her eyes kept drifting to the stack of mail her mother had left on the counter. The red letter was sticking out, just like yesterday. Faith had seen her mother's hand shake when she opened it this morning. The phone rang, making Faith jump. She let it go to voicemail, like her mother told her to do when she was home alone. "Ms. Williams, this is Marcus Reed from City Property Management. This is our final notice regarding your outstanding balance." The voice filled the quiet apartment. Faith grabbed the remote and turned on the TV, drowning out the rest of the message. She walked to the window, still wearing the blanket like a cape. Down below, kids from her school were walking home with their parents. Jessica from class climbed into a black SUV, her science project carefully carried by her father. "Your daddy coming to pick you up?" Tanya had asked her at lunch today. Faith had just shrugged, pushing her food around the plastic tray. "Don't got one. Everyone got one," Tommy had said from across the table. "He just ain't here." Faith pressed her forehead against the cold glass. The blanket smelled like her grandmother's apartment, like cinnamon and coffee and yarn. She remembered sitting on the floor while her grandmother's knitting needles clicked together, making each colorful square. "Why you making it with so many colors, Grandma?" she had asked. "Because life ain't just one color, baby. It's all of them together that make something beautiful." The memory made her throat tight. Her grandmother's chair still sat in the corner of their living room, empty now for almost a year. Faith hadn't wanted to sit in it since the funeral. Another train passed, and Faith watched the people on the street below hurry past Joey's Delicatessen. Mr. Jenkins was there, in his usual spot, his blue jacket pulled tight around him. The temperature had dropped since morning, and she could see his breath in the air. Someone had left a coffee cup next to him, but he hadn't touched it. He never asked for anything, never held out a cup or a sign like some of the other people on the street. He just sat there watching, his white beard moving slightly when he talked to himself. Faith's mother had told her his name once, when Faith asked why he was always there. "That's Mr. Jenkins. Used to see him in his business suit years ago, before things went bad. Now don't you be talking to him. Understand? People change when they're out on the street too long." The phone rang again. Faith turned the TV volume up higher. She went back to her homework, but the math problems wouldn't stick in her head. The blanket was warm around her shoulders, and she thought about Mr. Jenkins shivering outside. Her mother didn't get home until after 11, smelling like cleaning supplies from her second job. Faith pretended to be asleep when she heard the key in the lock. "Baby, you awake?" Her mother's whisper came through the door. Faith kept her eyes closed, listening to her mother's quiet movements in the kitchen. There was the sound of paper, probably looking at bills again. Then a muffled sob. Faith wanted to go out there, to hug her mother, but she stayed still under her grandmother's blanket. Sometimes adults needed to cry without having to explain why to their kids. The next morning, Faith woke up before the trains. She stood at her window in the dark, watching the street below. Mr. Jenkins was already there, huddled against the wall of the Delicatessen. It had rained overnight, and his jacket looked darker with water. "Faith, you're up early." Her mother appeared in the doorway, already in her supermarket uniform. "Mama, why don't some people have homes?" Her mother's face changed, got harder and softer at the same time. "It's complicated, baby. Sometimes bad things happen to people, and they don't have family to help them. Sometimes they make bad choices, or people take advantage of them. Like Mr. Jenkins? What did I tell you about watching him?" Her mother came into the room, putting a hand on Faith's shoulder. "World's not fair, baby. All we can do is work hard and take care of each other." At school that day, Faith couldn't concentrate. Ms. Rodriguez was teaching fractions, but Faith kept thinking about divisions of a different kind. Why some people had warm homes and others didn't. Why some kids had two parents at science fairs and others had empty chairs. During recess, she watched Jessica and her friends playing with new phones their parents had bought them. Faith's hand went to her neck, feeling the key to her empty apartment hanging on its string. "My daddy's taking me shopping after school," Jessica announced to everyone nearby. "He says I did so good at the science fair, I can pick anything I want." Faith thought about the red notice in their kitchen, about her mother's muffled crying, about Mr. Jenkins and his wet jacket. She touched the corner of her grandmother's blanket, which she'd stuffed in her backpack that morning. The afternoon got colder, and dark clouds rolled in from the east. Faith watched them through the classroom window, thinking about rain and wet jackets and warm blankets. When the final bell rang, Faith didn't take her usual route home. She stood across the street from Joey's Delicatessen, her grandmother's blanket clutched in her arms. Mr. Jenkins was there, his shoulders hunched against the wind. She thought about empty chairs and full ones, about warm apartments and cold sidewalks, about her grandmother's words about colors and beauty. The blanket felt heavy in her arms, heavy with memories and love and decision. Faith looked up at the dark clouds, then back at Mr. Jenkins. Sometimes the world divided people into those who had things and those who didn't. Sometimes it took someone willing to cross that divide to make things right. The wind picked up, carrying the first cold drops of rain. Faith took a deep breath, holding her grandmother's last gift close one final time. Then she stepped off the curb, crossing the street toward the man in the blue jacket, her choice made with the simple clarity that only children possess. The first drops of rain hit the sidewalk as Faith crossed the street. Her school shoes made soft tapping sounds against the wet concrete. Mr. Jenkins didn't look up as she approached, his eyes fixed on some distant point down the street. Faith stopped 5 feet away from him, her grandmother's blanket pressed against her chest. Up close, she could see the frayed edges of his blue jacket, the worn spots on his shoes, the trembling in his hands from the cold. "Mr. Jenkins?" Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. He turned slowly, his eyes focusing on her. They were brown, like her grandmother's had been. "Little miss?" His voice was rough but gentle. "I see you here every day," Faith said, taking one step closer. "And it's getting cold." A woman walking past pulled her purse closer and hurried by. Through the delicatessen window, Joey was watching, his thick arms crossed over his chest. "You shouldn't be talking to strangers, little miss," Mr. Jenkins said, but he smiled slightly, showing gaps where teeth used to be. Faith looked down at the blanket in her arms. Each square her grandmother had made was a different color. Red like Jessica's new backpack, blue like Mr. Jenkins' jacket, yellow like the supermarket vest her mother wore, green like the lima beans growing in her science project. "My grandma made this," she said, running her fingers over the yarn. "Before she went to heaven. She said everything beautiful got all the colors together." Mr. Jenkins watched her hands move over the blanket. His own hands were stuffed deep in his jacket pockets, but Faith could see them shaking. "That's a special thing you got there," he said. "Better keep it safe." Faith took another step forward. "You're shaking, Mr. Jenkins." He tried to smile again. "Just a little autumn chill. Nothing to worry about." The rain was falling harder now. Water dripped from the delicatessen's awning, forming puddles on the sidewalk. Faith's school uniform was getting wet, but she didn't move. "Here," she said, holding out the blanket. "You need it more than me." Mr. Jenkins stared at the blanket, then at her face. "No, little miss. I can't take that. It's your grandma's gift. She want you to have it." Faith's arms stayed outstretched. She always said helping people was the most beautiful thing you could do. A tear rolled down Mr. Jenkins' weathered cheek, mixing with the rain. His hands came out of his pockets, shaking not just from cold now. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice cracking. Faith nodded, stepping forward and placing the blanket in his hands. The yarn felt warm, like it always did, like it held some of her grandmother's love inside it. Mr. Jenkins unfolded the blanket with trembling fingers. "All these colors," he whispered, "like a rainbow in my hands." He wrapped it around his shoulders, over his thin jacket. The colors seemed brighter against the gray day, like a piece of hope someone had dropped on the wet sidewalk. "Thank you, little miss," he said, more tears falling now. "Thank you." Faith felt something warm in her chest, even as the rain soaked through her uniform. She thought her grandmother would be proud, would understand why her last gift needed to keep someone else warm now. Faith Williams. Her mother's voice cut through the rain like lightning. Faith turned. Her mother was running toward her from the supermarket, still in her red vest, face tight with fear and anger. "What are you doing? Get away from him." Her mother grabbed her arm, pulling her back across the street. Faith stumbled, her wet shoes slipping on the concrete. "Mama, wait. I told you never to talk to strangers." Her mother's voice shook. "Never." Through the rain, Faith saw Mr. Jenkins stand up, the blanket still around his shoulders. He took a step forward, like he wanted to explain, then stopped, sinking back against the wall. "He was cold, Mama." Faith tried to explain as her mother dragged her into the supermarket's entrance. "He needed it more than me." "That was your grandmother's blanket," her mother said, kneeling down and gripping Faith's shoulders. "Her last gift to you. How could you just give it away?" "Because she'd want." "You don't know what she'd want." Her mother's eyes were wet, and Faith couldn't tell if it was rain or tears. "You don't know what kind of people are out there, what they might do." Mr. Thompson, the store manager, came over. "Everything okay, Lisa? You can take 5 if you need it." Faith's mother stood up, wiping her eyes. "No, sir. I'm fine. Just need to call my neighbor to watch Faith." The ride home was silent. Mrs. Chun from next door picked Faith up from the supermarket in her old Toyota, clucking her tongue the whole way, but not asking questions. Faith sat at the kitchen table, now in dry clothes, while Mrs. Chun made her hot chocolate. The apartment felt different without the blanket, colder, emptier. "Your mama works so hard," Mrs. Chun said, setting the mug down. "She just wants you safe." Faith wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "Mr. Jenkins wouldn't hurt nobody. He just sits there, being cold." Mrs. Chun sighed. "World's not simple like that, child." But it was simple to Faith. Cold people needed warmth. Sad people needed colors. Empty chairs needed to be filled. Her grandmother had taught her that. When her mother came home that night, earlier than usual, her anger had turned to exhaustion. "Faith, baby," she said, sitting at the table. "I know you wanted to help, but we got to be careful. We got to think about ourselves first." "Is Mr. Jenkins bad?" Faith asked. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. "No, baby. He's not bad. He's just lost. Like a lot of people out there." "Then why can't we help him?" "Because we barely holding on ourselves." Her mother pulled out the red notice from her purse. "We got our own problems, rent's going up again. They might make us leave if we can't pay." Faith thought about Mr. Jenkins, about not having a home at all. Where would we go? "Don't you worry about that." Her mother tried to smile. "Get ready for bed now." That night, for the first time since her grandmother died, Faith slept without the blanket. Her bed felt bigger, colder. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Mr. Jenkins wrapped in all those colors, saw her grandmother smile, felt that warm feeling in her chest again. Outside, the trains kept running, shaking the walls of their apartment. The rain kept falling on the Bronx streets. And somewhere out there, a man in a blue jacket slept under a blanket made of many colors, while a little girl learned that sometimes giving away your most precious thing could fill you up with something even more precious. The morning after Faith gave away her grandmother's blanket, she pressed her face against the window before school. Mr. Jenkins wasn't in his usual spot by Joey's Delicatessen. The sidewalk looked empty without him there. "Come eat your breakfast," her mother called from the kitchen. Her voice was tired, like she hadn't slept much. Faith sat at the table, poking at her cereal. "Is Mr. Jenkins okay?" Her mother put down her coffee cup harder than usual. "Faith, we talked about this. No more thinking about that, man. But, no buts. Eat your breakfast. You're walking with Mrs. Chun to school today." The walk to school was different with Mrs. Chun. She talked the whole way about her son in college and her arthritis, not noticing when Faith kept looking toward the empty spot by the delicatessen. "Need milk," Mrs. Chun announced suddenly, turning toward Joey's store. "Come." The bell above the door jingled as they entered. Joey stood behind the counter, his white apron stretched across his belly. He nodded at Mrs. Chun, then looked at Faith. Hey kid, saw what you did yesterday. Faith stared at her shoes while Mrs. Chun went to get milk. You know who he is? Jenkins? Joey leaned on the counter. Used to be somebody important. Wall Street guy. Had a corner office and everything. Faith looked up. Really? Joey nodded, grabbing a rag to wipe the counter. Yeah. Used to come in here wearing suits that cost more than my monthly rent. Always ordered the same thing. Pastrami on rye, extra mustard. What happened to him? Bad people happened. Some guys he trusted took everything he had. His money, his house, his reputation. Been on the streets ever since. Joey, Mrs. Chin called from the back. How much for milk? $3.49. He called back, then looked at Faith again. Your blanket, that was a nice thing you did. First time I seen him cry in all these years. In class, Faith couldn't concentrate. She kept thinking about Mr. Jenkins in a suit, working in a tall building, eating pastrami sandwiches. How did someone go from that to sitting on a cold sidewalk? Faith? The answer to question 6? Ms. Rodriguez asked. Faith stared at her math worksheet. The numbers blurred together. Earth to Faith. Tommy called out, making some kids laugh. That's enough, Ms. Rodriguez said. Faith, see me after class. During lunch, Jessica walked past Faith's table. Hey, I saw you yesterday. Talking to that homeless guy. Faith kept eating her sandwich. My dad says we're not supposed to talk to those people. They're dangerous. Mr. Jenkins isn't dangerous, Faith said. He used to work on Wall Street. Jessica laughed. You right? And my dad's the president. It's true, Joey said. Joey who works at the gross old deli? Please. Jessica rolled her eyes. I can't believe you gave him your blanket. That's so weird. Other kids were listening now. Faith felt her face get hot. Was it even clean? Tommy asked. Probably got bugs now. Shut up, Faith said, her hands closing into fists. Faith! Ms. Rodriguez's voice cut through the cafeteria noise. We don't tell people to shut up. That afternoon, Faith didn't wait for Mrs. Chun. She ran to Joey's delicatessen as soon as school let out. The sidewalk was still empty. The bell jingled as she went inside. Joey, have you seen Mr. Jenkins today? Joey shook his head. Not since yesterday. Sometimes he disappears for a few days. Usually turns up again, but it's cold outside. Yeah. Joey sighed. It is. Faith pressed her face against the store window, watching people walk past. None of them seemed to notice the empty spot where Mr. Jenkins should be. He really worked on Wall Street? She asked. 30 years. Joey started stacking cans on a shelf. Had a family too. Son's some big-shot lawyer now. Haven't seen him around here in years, though. Why doesn't his son help him? Joey shrugged. Pride, maybe. Shame. A lot of things keep families apart. Faith thought about her own father, who left before she could remember him. But he's still his dad. World ain't that simple, kid. Back home, Faith tried to do her homework, but her mind kept wandering. The apartment felt wrong without her grandmother's blanket. The empty chair in the corner seemed to watch her. Her mother came home early from the supermarket, looking worried. Faith, Mrs. Chun said you weren't there after school. I went to Joey's to look for him. Her mother sat down heavily. Baby, you gotta let this go. He used to work on Wall Street, Mama. Had a family and everything. I know. Her mother rubbed her eyes. I remember when it happened. Was in all the papers. Some big investment scandal. A lot of people lost everything. Why didn't nobody help him? Sometimes people don't want help. Sometimes they're too ashamed to ask for it. Faith got up and went to the window. The street lights were coming on, making circles of yellow on the wet sidewalk. Somewhere out there, Mr. Jenkins was wrapped in her grandmother's blanket. She hoped it was keeping him warm. I'm not mad about the blanket anymore, her mother said quietly. I understand why you did it. Your grandma would have done the same thing. Faith turned. Really? Really? Her mother smiled slightly. She always said you had her heart, big enough to help the whole world. That night, Faith dreamed about Mr. Jenkins. In her dream, he wore a suit and tie, carried a briefcase, ate pastrami sandwiches. Then everything disappeared like smoke, leaving just a man in a blue jacket holding a colorful blanket. She woke up early, before the train started running. The sky outside was still dark. Faith pressed her face against the cold window, scanning the empty street below. "Where are you, Mr. Jenkins?" she whispered. The sun rose over the Bronx, painting the buildings gold. People started filling the sidewalks, heading to work, to school, to wherever people went so early in the morning. But the spot outside Joey's Delicatessen stayed empty, like a missing tooth in the city's smile. Faith got ready for school slowly, hoping Mr. Jenkins would appear. She kept thinking about what Joey said, about pride and shame, about families falling apart, about how someone could go from having everything to having nothing. As she walked to school with her mother that morning, Faith realized something. Maybe giving away the blanket wasn't just about keeping Mr. Jenkins warm. Maybe it was about showing him that somebody still cared, that somebody could look at him and see not what he'd lost, but what he still was, a person who deserved warmth, colors, kindness. The spot by the Delicatessen was still empty when they passed. Faith touched the window of Joey's store, leaving a small handprint on the glass. Somewhere in the city, a man who used to wear expensive suits was carrying a piece of her grandmother's love with him. She just hoped it was enough to bring him back. Chapter 5. The search. Faith didn't touch her lunch. She stared at her sandwich, watching other kids eat and laugh around her. Her stomach felt tight with worry. Mr. Jenkins had been missing for 2 days now. "You gonna eat that?" Tommy asked, reaching for her apple. Faith pulled her tray away. "It's not for you." After the lunch bell rang, she wrapped her sandwich in a napkin and stuffed it in her backpack. Maybe Mr. Jenkins would be hungry when she found him. "Faith, where are you going?" Tanya called as Faith headed toward the door instead of their next class. "Tell Ms. Rodriguez I got a stomach ache." Outside, the autumn wind bit through her uniform sweater. Faith walked quickly, checking every alley and doorway along her usual route home. No sign of Mr. Jenkins or her grandmother's blanket. She pushed open the door to Joey's Delicatessen, the bell jingling overhead. "Back again?" Joey looked up from his newspaper. "Still haven't seen him, kid." "But where would he go?" Faith's voice cracked a little. Joey sighed, putting down his paper. "Sometimes he goes to the shelter on 183rd. Sometimes the church on Webster. Can't tell you more than that." Faith's feet hurt in her school shoes, but she kept walking. The church was empty except for an old woman praying in the front pew. No sign of Mr. Jenkins. The shelter was further away. Faith had never walked there alone before. Her mother would be furious if she knew. A man in a green vest stopped her at the shelter door. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Mr. Jenkins. He has my grandma's blanket." "Jenkins?" The man frowned. "Haven't seen him this week." "You shouldn't be here alone, little girl. Where are your parents?" Faith turned away before he could ask more questions. Her legs were tired, and she was getting cold. The sandwich in her backpack felt heavy, like her guilt. Back at Joey's, she pressed her face against the window, watching the spot where Mr. Jenkins should be. "Your mom called," Joey said behind her. "She's worried sick. Mrs. Chen's coming to get you." "What if something bad happened to him?" Faith asked, not turning around. "He survived worse winters than this." "Go home, kid." Mrs. Chen arrived in her rattling Toyota, muttering in Chinese the whole way up to Faith's apartment. Faith's mother was waiting at the door, still in her supermarket vest. "What were you thinking?" Her mother grabbed her in a tight hug. "Skipping school? Walking around alone? I had to find him, Mama. He's got Grandma's blanket." "The blanket's gone, baby. You gave it away. That was your choice. But he's gone too." Her mother's face softened. "Sometimes people move on. That's their choice." Faith went to her room, the empty bed reminding her of her missing blanket. She heard her mother talking quietly with Mrs. Chan in the kitchen. "Final notice came today. How much do you need?" "More than I can borrow." Faith pulled her pillow over her ears. The trains rattled the windows, and she remembered how Mr. Jenkins used to shake in the cold. That night, she couldn't sleep. The apartment felt different, like all the warmth was being sucked out through the cracks in the walls. Her mother's muffled crying came through the thin walls. Faith got up and went to the kitchen. The final eviction notice sat on the table. Stark red letters warning they had 3 days to pay or leave. Her mother looked up, wiping her eyes. "Baby, you should be in bed." "Is this my fault? Because I gave away the blanket?" "No." Her mother pulled her close. "No, baby. This isn't about the blanket. We've been struggling for a while now. Where will we go?" "I'm trying to figure that out." Her mother's voice was thick. "Maybe my sister in Jersey. Faith thought about Mr. Jenkins, about how someone could lose everything and end up on the street. We won't be like him, right? We won't have to sleep outside. Her mother's arms tightened around her. Never. I promise you that. The next morning, Faith woke up early again. The sky was gray, threatening rain. She got dressed quickly, her uniform feeling heavy on her shoulders. I made you lunch, her mother said, holding out a paper bag. There were dark circles under her eyes. You're not mad anymore? About me looking for Mr. Jenkins? Her mother touched her cheek. I understand why you did it. But no more skipping school, okay? Promise me. I promise. The walk to school felt longer than usual. The spot outside Joey's was still empty, but Faith saw something new, a coffee cup sitting exactly where Mr. Jenkins usually sat. She went into the store. Joey? Did someone leave that cup? Joey nodded. Every morning this week. Same time, same cup. Black coffee, extra sugar. Just like you used to order. Who leaves it? Don't know. Gone before I open up. Faith stared at the cup. Someone else was looking for Mr. Jenkins, too. Someone else remembered how he liked his coffee. In class, she tried to focus on Ms. Rodriguez's lesson about fractions. But her mind kept dividing things differently. People with homes and people without. People who disappeared and people who stayed. People who remembered and people who forgot. During recess, she heard Jessica talking to her friends. My dad says they're clearing out all the homeless people before winter. Sending them somewhere else. Faith's heart jumped. What do you mean, clearing them out? Jessica rolled her eyes. Making them go away. So they don't bother normal people. They are normal people. Faith stood up. Mr. Jenkins used to be just like your dad. You're right. My dad would never end up like that. You don't know nothing. Faith felt tears coming. You don't know what happened to him. Faith! Ms. Rodriguez called from across the playground. Inside now, in the empty classroom, Ms. Rodriguez sat with Faith while she cried. Want to tell me what's going on? Faith told her everything, about the blanket, about Mr. Jenkins disappearing, about the eviction notice, about the coffee cup someone kept leaving. Ms. Rodriguez listened without interrupting. When Faith finished, she handed her a tissue. Sometimes we can't fix everything, she said gently. But that doesn't mean we should stop caring. But what if he's hurt? What if he's cold? He has your grandmother's blanket. That's more than he had before. After school, Faith walked home with Mrs. Chun, but her eyes kept scanning the streets, looking for a flash of colorful yarn, a blue jacket, a white beard. The rain started just as they reached her building. Faith watched the drops hit the sidewalk, making circles that reminded her of the coffee cup by Joey's store. Somewhere in the vast city, a man carried a piece of her grandmother's love with him. Somewhere, someone remembered how he liked his coffee. Somewhere, Mr. Jenkins was either finding his way back or moving on forever. Faith pressed her hand against the cold window, leaving 5 small fingerprints like stars in the gathering dark. The trains kept running, the rain kept falling, and the Bronx kept moving, indifferent to one missing man and the little girl who gave him her most precious possession. The black car appeared on a Wednesday morning. Faith saw it from her window, long and shiny, like something from a movie, with windows tinted so dark they looked like mirrors. It rolled slowly down their street, out of place among the rusty sedans and delivery trucks. Faith, you're going to be late, her mother called from the kitchen. But Faith couldn't move. The car had stopped right in front of their building. Mama, come look. Her mother appeared beside her, clutching her supermarket vest. Her breath caught when she saw the car. Get away from the window. Why? Who is it? Just get ready for school. Her mother's voice shook slightly. Mrs. Chin's waiting. Down on the street, neighbors were stopping to stare. Mrs. Rodriguez from 3B hurried her kids inside. Old Mr. Guzman pulled his shopping cart closer to the building wall. The car's engine kept running, a quiet purr that somehow seemed louder than the trains. Now, Faith. Her mother grabbed her backpack, through the back stairs. But no arguments. They rushed down the back stairwell, past the broken light on the 3rd floor, past the graffiti on the 2nd. Faith's mother kept looking over her shoulder. Mrs. Chun was waiting in her car, engine running. Quick, quick, she waved. As they pulled away, Faith saw a man get out of the black car. He wore an expensive suit, like the ones Joey said Mr. Jenkins used to wear. He was looking up at their building. "Mama, who is that man?" Her mother didn't answer, just squeezed her hand tighter. At school, Faith couldn't focus. She kept thinking about the black car, about the man in the suit, about how scared her mother looked. "Faith!" Ms. Rodriguez touched her shoulder. The bell rang. "It's lunchtime." In the cafeteria, Jessica was talking loudly about the car she'd seen that morning. It was a Rolls-Royce. "My dad has one just like it. Only rich people have those." "It was by Faith's building," Tommy said. "Maybe they're finally kicking all the poor people out." Faith's sandwich turned to dust in her mouth. She thought about the eviction notice on their kitchen table. When the final bell rang, Faith ran outside before Mrs. Chun could catch her. She had to see if the car was still there. It was. The man in the suit stood talking to Joey outside the delicatessen. Faith crept closer, hiding behind a parked van. "Haven't seen him in 3 days," Joey was saying. The girl gave him a blanket. "Colorful thing, handmade." "What girl?" The man's voice was deep, tired. "Lives in that building there. Faith Williams, good kid." Faith's heart stopped. They were talking about her. About Mr. Jenkins. "And you say he was here every day before that?" "Like clockwork. Same spot, same blue jacket." The man rubbed his face. Faith saw his hands were shaking, just like Mr. Jenkins used to. "Sir?" Joey leaned forward. "You're his son, aren't you?" "The lawyer." The man didn't answer. He turned suddenly, and Faith ducked behind the van. When she peeked out again, he was getting back into the black car. Faith ran all the way home, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Her mother wasn't back from work yet. Through her window, she could see the car was still there, engine running, windows like black ice. The man sat inside, staring up at their building. The afternoon stretched on. Neighbors whispered in the hallways. Kids pressed their faces against windows. The black car didn't move. When her mother finally came home, she was carrying grocery bags. "We're staying inside tonight," she said, locking the door. No opening for anyone. "But Mama, I know who he is." I don't care who he is. We're not getting involved." Faith watched her mother put away groceries with shaking hands. "Are we in trouble?" "No, baby." Her mother stopped, leaning against the counter. "But sometimes trouble finds you anyway." Night fell. The streetlights came on, making the black car gleam like wet paint. Faith sat by her window watching. The man hadn't moved. At midnight, someone knocked on their door. Her mother froze in front of the TV. The knock came again, soft but firm. "Ms. Williams?" A deep voice called. "I'm Richard Jenkins. I need to speak with your daughter." Faith's mother grabbed her phone. "I'm calling the police." "Please," the voice said. "It's about my father." "In a blanket." Faith ran to the door before her mother could stop her. "Your dad's got my grandma's blanket." "Faith, no!" Her mother lunged for her. But Faith had already turned the lock. The door swung open. The man from the car stood there, his expensive suit wrinkled now. Up close, Faith could see he had the same brown eyes as Mr. Jenkins. "You're his son," she said. "The lawyer Joey told me about." He nodded slowly. "And you're the little girl who gave him the blanket." "Faith, get away from him." Her mother's voice was steel. "I've been looking for my father for 3 days," the man said. "Ever since I heard about the blanket, about what your daughter did." "How'd you hear?" Faith asked. "The owner of the coffee shop next to Joey's. She's been leaving him coffee every morning for years. She saw what happened. Call my office." Faith remembered the coffee cups. Black with extra sugar? The man's eyes filled with tears. "You know how he takes his coffee?" "Joey told me. Said that's how he used to drink it. When he worked on Wall Street." Her mother's hand found Faith's shoulder. "Mr. Jenkins, it's midnight. Whatever this is about, I haven't seen my father in 5 years." He cut in. Not since everything fell apart. The scandal, the trials, He stopped, swallowing hard. "But when I heard about the blanket, about this little girl who saw him as a person, and not just—" "He was cold," Faith said simply. "Grandma's blanket was warm." The man knelt down to her level. His eyes were red. "Do you know where he is?" Faith shook her head. "He disappeared after I gave him the blanket. I looked everywhere. I've been watching your building all day," he said, "hoping he'd come back here." "Hoping? Why didn't you help him before?" Faith's mother asked. "He's been out there for years. Pride. Shame. Anger. He stood up slowly. All the things that keep families apart. But when I heard about the blanket, about this little girl who could see past all that, a train rumbled past, shaking the building. Faith thought about Mr. Jenkins sitting in his spot, wrapped in her grandmother's colors. He used to wear suits like yours, she said. That's what Joey told me. The man touched his tie. Yes, he taught me how to tie one. Before everything. Before I let my anger keep me from helping him. Faith's mother's grip on her shoulder loosened slightly. What do you want from us? Help, he said simply. Help finding him. Help bringing him home. The hallway fell silent. Even the trains seemed to hold their breath. Faith looked up at her mother, then back at Mr. Jenkins' son. We can help, but first you gotta know something. What's that? The blanket, it's got all the colors in it. Grandma said that's what makes things beautiful. Even the broken things. The man's tears fell freely now. Outside, the black car gleamed under the street lights, waiting to carry his son in search of his father. Guided by a little girl who gave away her most precious possession and got something even more precious in return. The chance to help a broken family find their colors again. Faith sat at her kitchen table across from Richard Jenkins, his expensive suit jacket draped over one of their mismatched chairs. Her mother stood by the counter, arms crossed, watching. Tell me everything, Richard said. From the beginning, the kitchen clock ticked past 1 a.m. Faith's school uniform was wrinkled from the long day, but she didn't feel tired. He was always there, she started. Outside Joey's. Every day, same spot. In the blue jacket, Richard said softly. Faith nodded. It got cold last week. Real cold. He was shaking, but he never asked nobody for nothing. Her mother shifted against the counter, but didn't speak. Joey told me about him. Said he used to work in a big building, wear nice suits. Like yours. Richard touched his tie again, a nervous gesture. Wall Street. Senior investment banker. What's that mean? It means... Richard paused. It means he helped people with their money. Until some bad people tricked him. Made him help them steal. Did he know they were bad? Richard's hands tightened on the table. No. He trusted them. They were his friends, or he thought they were. Faith remembered Jessica's words about her father. And then he lost everything? The police came. There were trials. Newspapers. Richard's voice cracked. I was a new lawyer then. Everyone said I should distance myself. Protect my career. So you left him alone? Faith, her mother warned. But Richard held up his hand. No, she's right to ask. He looked at Faith. Yes, I left him alone. He lost his job, his house, his reputation. And instead of helping him, I walked away. The trains rattled past, making the dishes in the sink clink together. Did you look for him? Before now. Once. 2 years ago. Richard stared at his hands. I saw him outside Joey's. But I couldn't get out of the car. Faith thought about the black car waiting outside, about how long it had taken him to finally step out of it. He was scared too, she said. Richard looked up. What? When I tried to give him the blanket, he didn't want to take it first. Said it was too special. Her mother came to the table, finally sitting down. It was her grandmother's last gift before she passed. Richard turned to Faith's mother. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Neither did he. Faith cut in. But when I told him about Grandma, how she said helping people was beautiful, he started crying. He cried? Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Faith nodded. Like you're crying now? Richard wiped his eyes quickly. The coffee shop owner, she said. She said he held the blanket like it was precious. It is precious, Faith said. It's got all the colors in it. Like people do. Her mother reached over, touching Faith's hand. Baby, what do you mean? Grandma said everybody's got all the colors in them. Good ones and bad ones. Happy ones and sad ones. That's what makes us people. Richard stood up suddenly, walking to the window. Outside, his black car gleamed under the streetlights. I was so angry at him, he said, for trusting the wrong people, for losing everything, for making me ashamed. Were you mad? Faith asked, or scared? He turned back to them. What? Sometimes when Mama yells, she's not really mad. She's scared. Like when I gave Mr. Jenkins the blanket. Her mother squeezed her hand. I was scared, Richard admitted. Scared of becoming like him. Scared of losing what I'd built. scared of facing him after walking away. "But he's still your dad," Faith said. "Like the blanket's still got Grandma's love in it, even if somebody else has it now." Richard came back to the table. "Will you help me find him? Tell me everything you know about his routine, where he goes." Faith looked at her mother, who nodded slowly. "He sits by Joey's from morning till dark," Faith started. "Sometimes he goes to the shelter on 183rd or the church on Webster. Joey gives him water when it's hot. The coffee shop lady leaves him coffee every morning," her mother added. "Black with extra sugar. Someone from the bakery brings day-old bread on Thursdays," Faith continued. "And Mrs. Chun from next door, she gives him oranges sometimes." Richard's hands were shaking on the table. "All these people, all this time, people see him," Faith said. "They just see different things. Joey sees who he used to be. The coffee lady sees how he likes his coffee. I saw he was cold. And what do you think I'll see?" Richard asked. "When I find him." "Your dad," Faith said simply. "Just your dad?" Another train passed, and Faith yawned despite herself. The kitchen clock showed 2 a.m. "We should continue this tomorrow," her mother said, standing. "Faith has school." Richard nodded, reaching for his jacket. He pulled out a business card, then hesitated. Joey mentioned." He looked at Faith's mother. "You're having trouble with the building management?" Her mother stiffened. "We'll manage. I'm sure you will." He placed his card on the table. "But when you're ready to discuss it, my firm handles housing law. Pro bono. We don't need charity." "It's not charity." He looked at Faith. "It's giving what you can to help someone who needs it. Like a blanket on a cold day." Faith's mother stared at the card for a long moment before picking it up. At the door, Richard turned back. "Faith." "Yes." "Thank you. For seeing my father when I couldn't. For giving him your colors when all I saw was gray." After he left, Faith watched from her window as he got into the black car. But this time it didn't drive away. It stayed there, keeping watch through the night, like a son finally ready to wait for his father. Her mother came up behind her, wrapping her arms around Faith's shoulders. "You really are like your grandma," she said softly, seeing the colors and people. Faith leaned back against her mother, watching the black car gleam in the darkness. Somewhere in the city, a man slept under a blanket of many colors, not knowing his son was finally looking for him. Guided by a little girl who gave away a piece of her grandmother's love and got back a piece of someone else's hope in return. Morning came with the usual rattle of trains, but something was different. The black car was still there, its windows catching the first light of dawn. Faith pressed her nose against her bedroom window. Richard Jenkins sat in the driver's seat, his head tilted back, sleeping. He'd stayed all night. "Faith!" Her mother appeared in the doorway, already in her supermarket vest. "Get ready for school." "He's still out there, Mama." Her mother came to look. "I know, baby." "Are you going to call him?" "About the lawyer job?" Her mother touched the business card in her vest pocket. "Let's just get through today first." At breakfast, Faith noticed her mother's hands weren't shaking when she poured the coffee. The red eviction notice was gone from the table. "Mr. Thompson's going to be mad," Faith said. "You're late for work." "I called in." Her mother sat down, something she never did in the morning. "Told him I had a family situation." Faith ate her cereal slowly, watching her mother stare into her coffee cup. "Would we have to move? If you work for Mr. Jenkins? His firm's in Manhattan." Her mother's voice was quiet. "But we'd make it work." "Better than—" She didn't finish, but Faith knew what she meant. Better than being evicted. Better than losing everything like Mr. Jenkins had. The walk to school was different that morning. The black car pulled away from the curb, following slowly behind them. "He's making sure we're safe," her mother said before Faith could ask. Outside Joey's, Faith stopped. The spot where Mr. Jenkins usually sat was empty, but something was different. The coffee cup was there like always, but next to it sat a white paper bag. "It's from the bakery," Joey said from his doorway. "Thursday's bread day, remember?" Faith looked at Richard's car, idling nearby. He was watching the empty spot where his father should be. In class, Faith couldn't focus on Ms. Rodriguez's lesson. She kept thinking about the coffee cup and bread, about people remembering Mr. Jenkins in their own ways. At lunch, Jessica walked past her table. "That fancy car's not there to kick you out?" "No," Faith said. "It's someone looking for their dad." Jessica paused. The homeless guy? For real. His name is Mr. Jenkins. And his son's a lawyer, just like your dad. Jessica's face changed slightly. Oh. After school, the black car was waiting. Richard stepped out, his suit wrinkled from sleeping in the car. Any ideas where else we could look? He asked Faith. She thought for a moment. The library. Sometimes when it rains, he sits in there all day. The librarian lets him. They drove to the library in the big black car, Faith and her mother in the back seat. The leather seats smelled new, like the inside of a shoe store. He reads the newspaper, Faith said. Every day if he can get one. Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He always read 3 papers every morning. Said you couldn't trust just one version of the truth. The library was quiet, smelling of books and dust. Miss Garcia, the librarian, looked up as they entered. Faith? No after-school program today. We're looking for Mr. Jenkins, Faith said. The man with the blue jacket. Miss Garcia's eyes moved to Richard. Haven't seen him this week. But she pulled something from under her desk. He left this last time he was here. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, Wall Street banker found guilty in investment scandal. Richard took the clipping with shaking hands. He kept this? Said it reminded him of something important. Miss Garcia watched Richard carefully. Are you his son? Richard couldn't take his eyes off the clipping. I'm his son. They drove around for 2 more hours, checking the shelter, the church, the park. No sign of Mr. Jenkins or the colorful blanket. Back at their apartment, Richard handed Faith's mother a folder. The paperwork. For the job, he straightened his tie. The firm needs a new office manager. Someone organized, responsible, good with people. Faith's mother started to protest, but he held up his hand. I called references. Joey, Miss Garcia, even your Mr. Thompson at the supermarket. They all say the same thing. You're the hardest worker they know. Her mother's hands shook as she opened the folder. This salaries, standard for the position, plus benefits, healthcare, retirement plan. Faith watched her mother's face as she read. The worry lines around her eyes were softening. 1 job, Richard said quietly. Not 2. Regular hours. Home for dinner. Faith's mother looked up at him. Why? Because my father lost everything trying to help the wrong people. Maybe I can make it right by helping the right ones. That night, Faith watched her mother make phone calls. To Mr. Thompson at the supermarket. To the cleaning company. To her sister in Jersey. It's a real job, Sharon. In a law firm. No, I can't believe it either. Faith sat in her grandmother's empty chair, feeling the worn fabric under her fingers. The apartment felt different, like the air had changed. Her mother hung up the phone and came to kneel in front of her. Things are going to be different, baby. Better. Because of the blanket? Her mother smiled, tears in her eyes. Because you saw someone who needed help and didn't walk away. Like I did, like his son did. You just helped? Grandma would have done it. Yes. Her mother hugged her tight. She would have. That night, Faith couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, watching Richard's car still parked outside. He was out there somewhere, looking for his father, following a trail of coffee cups and breadcrumbs and newspaper clippings. The trains kept rolling past, but their rattle felt different now. Less like shaking walls and more like the sound of things moving, changing, heading somewhere new. Faith thought about Mr. Jenkins, wrapped in her grandmother's colors, carrying a piece of her love somewhere in the city. She thought about his son, finally ready to see his father as more than his mistakes. She thought about her mother, about 1 job instead of 2, about dinner together instead of empty chairs. Sometimes giving away something precious made room for something even more precious to come in. Her grandmother had taught her that. With every colored square, she added to the blanket. And now Faith had taught it to others one cold autumn day when she decided that keeping someone warm was more important than holding on to memories that could be carried in your heart instead. A month had passed since Faith gave away her grandmother's blanket. The morning routine was different now. No more rushing. No more shaking hands with coffee cups. No more red notices on the table. Her mother stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her new blazer. The supermarket vest hung in the closet, retired. How do I look? She asked Faith. Like a lawyer's boss, Faith said, making her mother smile. The walk to school was different too. No more hurrying past Joey's delicatessen. They had time now to stop, to check if today might be the day Mr. Jenkins came back. Still no sign? Joey asked as they entered the store. Faith's mother shook her head. Richard's still looking. Every night after work, the coffee cup and bread were there like always. Waiting, hoping. At school, things had changed. Jessica didn't make fun of Faith anymore. Not since the day her father came to pick her up and saw Richard's car. My dad says your mom works at Jenkins and Morrison now, Jessica said during lunch. He says that's a really good firm. Faith nodded, eating her sandwich. A better job meant better lunches, but she still shared with Tanya, like always. Is it true? Tommy asked. About the homeless guy being a rich lawyer's dad? His name is Mr. Jenkins, Faith said. And he's not just somebody's dad. He's somebody. After school, Faith and her mother walked home together. No more empty apartment. No more waiting until midnight for the sound of tired footsteps. Richard called today, her mother said as they passed Joey's. They got a lead. Someone saw a man with a colorful blanket near the public library in Manhattan. Faith's heart jumped. Can we go look? Already sent someone to check. Her mother squeezed her hand. We'll find him, baby. Just gotta keep trying. The apartment felt warmer now, even with winter coming. They could afford to turn the heat up. Faith did her homework at the kitchen table while her mother cooked dinner. Real dinner, not just sandwiches. The train still rattled the windows, but the sound was more like background music now. Not the ticking of a clock counting down to the next bill, the next missed event, the next empty chair. Faith, her mother called from the kitchen. Richard's downstairs. Says he needs to talk to us. They took the elevator down. It was working now, after Richard made some calls to the building management. The black car was parked outside, but Richard wasn't in it. He stood by Joey's delicatessen, talking to someone. Someone in a blue jacket. Faith stopped breathing. Mr. Jenkins sat in his usual spot, her grandmother's blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The colors were a bit faded now, but still bright against the gray sidewalk. He was holding a coffee cup, black with extra sugar. Found him in a Manhattan library, Richard said as they approached. Reading the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Jenkins looked up at Faith, his brown eyes wet. Little miss? Faith moved closer, her mother's hand on her shoulder. You came back. Heard somebody was looking for me. He touched the blanket. Somebody who gave me colors when all I saw was gray. Richard knelt next to his father. We've all been looking, Dad. Me, Faith, Joey, the coffee shop lady, everyone. I know. Mr. Jenkins' voice was rough. Saw the coffee cups. The bread. Saw your car. Why didn't you come back sooner? Faith asked. Mr. Jenkins looked at the blanket. Had to decide if I deserved it. The colors. The care. The chance to come back. Of course you deserved it, Faith said. Everybody deserves to be warm. Richard helped his father stand. Mr. Jenkins was shakier than before. Thinner maybe, but his eyes were clearer. Got an apartment ready, Richard said. Near my place. If you want it. Mr. Jenkins gripped the blanket tighter. Don't need charity. It's not charity, Faith said. It's family. Like the colors in the blanket. They're all different, but they're all together. Mr. Jenkins looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, showing his missing teeth. Your grandma taught you good, little miss. She taught me about colors. But you taught me about giving. That night, their apartment was full. Joey brought sandwiches. Mrs. Chun brought oranges. The coffee shop lady, Miss Rosa, they learned, brought coffee for everyone. Richard and Mr. Jenkins sat at their small kitchen table. 5 years of silence, melting over pastrami on rye. Faith sat in her grandmother's chair, watching. Her mother moved around the kitchen in her new blazer, laughing with Miss Rosa about how Mr. Jenkins always insisted on extra sugar. Still can't believe you gave away your grandma's blanket, Tommy said. He'd come up with his mother, who lived down the hall. Didn't give it away, Faith said. Just shared it. Now it's got more love in it, not less. Later, when everyone had gone home except Richard and Mr. Jenkins, Faith's mother pulled out a box. Been saving for this, she said, handing it to Faith. Inside was yarn. Dozens of skeins, all different colors. Thought maybe, her mother said, we could learn to make blankets. Like your grandma did. Faith touched the yarn. Red like Jessica's backpack. Blue like Mr. Jenkins' jacket. Yellow like her mother's old supermarket vest. green like the money that didn't control their lives anymore. "I'll teach you," Mr. Jenkins said suddenly. Everyone looked at him. "What?" "My wife. She used to knit. Taught me some before she passed. Said it was good for shaky hands." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "You never told me that. A lot of things I never told you, son. Maybe it's time I did." Faith took out a strand of each color. "Can we make one together? All of us?" "Together," her mother said, smiling. That night, Faith looked out her window one last time before bed. The street looked different now. Not because anything had changed, really. The buildings were still old. The trains still rattled. The sidewalks still had cracks. But now she saw the colors. In the light from Joey's store, in Miss Rose's coffee shop sign, in the flowers Mrs. Chun kept in her window. In the people, too, all carrying their own blankets of memory and love, some faded, some bright, all precious. The black car was gone from the street. Richard had driven his father to his new apartment, promising to return tomorrow. Mr. Jenkins had left the blanket behind, draped over Faith's grandmother's chair. "Got enough colors now," he'd said. "Got my son back. Got a family looking out for me. Think maybe someone else might need these colors more." Faith touched the blanket, feeling all the love it had carried. Her grandmother's love in every stitch. Her own love in giving it away. Mr. Jenkins' love in accepting help. Richard's love in coming back. Her mother's love in working hard and coming home. All the colors together, making something beautiful. Tomorrow, they would start a new blanket. But tonight, Faith slept in her grandmother's chair, wrapped in a blanket that had traveled the city carrying hope, had brought a father and son back together, had taught a little girl that sometimes the most precious gifts are the ones you give away. Outside, the trains kept rolling, their rattle now a reminder that everything moves, everything changes, everything carries a piece of love from one place to another. Like blankets, like coffee cups, like colors in the darkness, waiting to be shared.